All right, guys and gals, we'll start here looking at Southeast Asia and imperialism and colonialism in Southeast Asia. Now, the top part of this map shows the year 1826. Okay, and if you look at the bottom key down here, you have different um, colonial interests: the Portuguese, the Dutch, Spanish, the British, and the French. The United States isn't in here, but they become a player in the Philippines, as you can see on the bottom, in 1898, okay, with the Spanish-American War. So you can see the colonial possessions up here are really limited to coastal areas near in Burma and the islands of the Philippines, okay? Also, you could see different countries hold ports. Now, again, ports are important because of the trading aspect of it and the availability to get goods in and out of those countries, all right? So if you're looking at this today, here's China, okay? And this is the Malaysian Peninsula. Now, at the bottom in 1914, and this year is critical because it's really the onset of World War I, you could see that there's an explosion of European possessions in Southeast Asia. This area up here that was Java is now renamed the Dutch East Indies. Okay, Borneo is now a Dutch possession as well. The Philippines are controlled by the United States, not Spain anymore. You see French in the area that is Vietnam, present-day Vietnam. The Spanish have a very limited influence, mainly because they abdicated their land to the United States. But you could see that from 1826 to 1914, so in the span of less than a century, European powers colonized Southeast Asia to an extreme extent. So talking about a couple of these different places now. In 1819, Great Britain colonizes Singapore. And really, why is Singapore important? Well, it's because of its strategic location, and it's a great port to trade with China. It's a good stopover. It's a good place to refuel, to bring goods out, and all that stuff. Thailand now is, on the mainland, and it remains really the only free state there. Two leaders, consecutive leaders, are they prevented imperialism mainly by playing a really good political game. Um, they were friendly with Western powers. They played the powers off of each other. They promoted Western values, so they took away the justification of the white man's burden and things like that. So Singapore, colonized by Great Britain in the early 1800s, mainly because of its location, and Thailand remains free because they really played the powers off each other and played their own game. Now, you guys probably remember this. Hopefully, you remember this from the introduction. But here's another political cartoon showing different European powers: the British, the Germans, the French. Here's the Americans and Lady Liberty, and the Japanese, all carving up the big piece of pie that is China. And you see a Chinese individual very stereotypically displayed here, with his facial hair, long fingernails, ponytail, all that stuff, peacock feather, just without any control over the situation. So each of the colonial powers at the bottom here has a knife. They're carving up this pie that is China, and the Chinese really don't have a whole lot of say in it. Now, China's a large country, and hopefully when we cover this next part, you'll see some present-day themes in there. But the imperialism, colonial, excuse me, colonizing and imperializing China are two very critical things, and it's very important to each of the Western powers to have that influence. Okay, if you remember back to the first semester, we talked about the dynastic cycle in China. The Qin dynasty is established in the mid 1600s and it lasts till 1911. That's a long time. If you remember back to the Mandate of Heaven, and all that business, the people believed that as long as things were going well, then the rulers had justification from a higher power that they need to remain in power. So this dynasty rules for a very long time and collapses really in 1911. You look at why do they collapse? Well, the peasants become unhappy with the government, mainly because of various political and social corruption. There is a lot of internal conflict between players in the country, and Western powers apply an extreme amount of China to allow them to have China open to the West. They want to trade with China. They want access to the Chinese markets. They want to modernize China, um, very much the same way that it is today. China was closed for a very long time, and they very reluctantly started to trade with the West, with Britain and France and all that stuff. And what ends up happening is you have a vast trade imbalance. We'll talk about that here in a second. Remember these guys, the British East India Company? They're the ones who really take control of India, and they also expand and early on have a huge presence in China. Okay, so they took Chinese goods that many people wanted, like silk, tea, porcelain. You could probably hear your parents or grandparents talking about using the good china at Easter or some other big meal. And that's just speaking of porcelain that maybe came from China, but there was a high demand for Chinese products. So they took silk, tea, and porcelain from China and um, brought cotton from India to China, and they used the cotton to make clothing and things like that. Hopefully, you could see that these items here, silk, tea, and porcelain, don't really add up, or they're not as valuable as cotton. So what you end up having is a huge trade imbalance. Okay, so the British East India Company ends up taking more from China than they bring in terms of goods and values. Okay, cotton could not just cover the trade debt. They could not cover the value of all the things they were taking out, the just porcelain, silk, and tea, simply with cotton. So they had to come up with another way in order to balance that out. All right. Think about today. We import a heck of a lot from China, and we can't sell them as much. So we're in the same position with the trade imbalance. All right. So now the British East India Company has to find some way to pay the Chinese that difference, excuse me. And really, it starts with gold and silver, but it quickly turns to opium. All right. Opium is a drug made from poppy plants. It's the derivative of it is heroin. It's highly addictive. People smoke it, they shoot it. It's just not a good thing. And at this time, they're smoking a lot of opium. Okay, so instead of necessarily just covering the trade imbalance with gold and silver, the Dutch East India Company brings opium to China, and this creates multiple problems. All right, we'll talk about that in the next session. Thanks, guys.